Cristiano Ronaldo had always been a man of the people. Despite his worldwide fame, endless accolades, and staggering wealth, he had never lost touch with his humble beginnings. Raised in a modest home in Madeira, Portugal, he had witnessed firsthand the struggles of a working-class family, the sacrifices made, and the unwavering resilience that had fueled his journey to the pinnacle of world football. That was why, on a seemingly ordinary evening, at a nearly deserted gas station on the outskirts of Lisbon, fate would set the stage for an unforgettable act of kindness that would change one man's life forever. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The night was cold, and the streetlights cast long flickering shadows across the cracked pavement. The gas station, one of those small forgotten stops along the highway, was barely holding on against the fierce competition of bigger, shinier service stations. It was here that Daniel, a 34-year-old single father, leaned against his aging sedan, staring at the numbers climbing rapidly on the pump. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his nearly empty wallet, his mind racing with worry. Daniel had been struggling for months. After losing his wife to an illness the previous year, he had been left to raise his 6-year-old son, Lucas, alone, juggling 2 jobs, one as a supermarket stocker during the day and another as a security guard at night, had drained him physically and emotionally. No matter how hard he worked, the bills kept piling up, and the cost of living seemed to tighten its grip around his throat like a relentless vice. Tonight, he had barely scraped together enough money to put gas in his car, which he needed to get to work. There was no room for luxuries, no space for anything beyond survival. As Daniel placed the nozzle back and trudged into the dimly lit gas station shop to pay, he didn't notice the sleek black sports car that pulled up beside his, nor did he recognize the towering, effortlessly stylish figure who stepped out, his signature confident stride making the action look almost cinematic. It was only when he reached the counter and heard the soft murmur of an excited gasp from the cashier that he turned and found himself face to face with Cristiano Ronaldo. For a moment, Daniel thought he was imagining things. Surely it couldn't be. The Cristiano Ronaldo, here at this random gas station in the middle of nowhere? But the realization settled quickly as he took in the Portuguese football legend's unmistakable features. Chiseled jawline, piercing eyes, and that aura of quiet confidence that could command an entire stadium. The cashier, a young woman barely out of her teens, fumbled with the register, her eyes wide in awe. Cristiano, noticing the stunned silence around him, simply smiled and nodded in greeting before grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. He was used to this reaction, though he had been hoping for a quiet stop. But then, just as he was about to pay for his drink and leave, his sharp eyes landed on Daniel. He had a knack for reading people, and something about the man's posture, the tired slump of his shoulders, the deep lines of exhaustion on his face, struck him. He stepped forward. "Are you okay, my friend?" His voice was warm, genuine. Daniel, still somewhat dazed, managed to nod. "Yes, just long day." Cristiano glanced at the counter and noticed Daniel pulling out a few crumpled bills, clearly counting to make sure he had enough to cover his gas. The sight triggered something deep inside him, a memory of his own mother struggling to make ends meet, of going to bed hungry, of the many sacrifices that had been made for him. "How much was your gas?" Cristiano asked suddenly. Daniel blinked. 30 euros? Cristiano smiled. "I'll cover it." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "Oh no, you don't have to do that," he said quickly, shaking his head, his pride battling against the unexpected generosity. "I want to," Cristiano insisted, already handing his credit card to the cashier. "And I'd like to add something else." The cashier, still somewhat in a trance, completed the transaction before Cristiano turned back to Daniel. "Do you have a moment to talk?" Daniel hesitated, but then nodded. They stepped outside, away from the curious gaze of the cashier, into the crisp night air. Cristiano leaned against the car, studying the man beside him. "You look like someone who's carrying a lot on his shoulders," he observed. Daniel exhaled deeply. "You could say that." And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, the words began to pour out. He told Cristiano about his wife, about Lucas, about the struggle of working 2 jobs and still barely making it through the month. He wasn't looking for pity. He just needed to let it out. And to his surprise, Cristiano listened, truly listened. not just with polite nods or empty words, but with an intensity that made it clear he understood. When Daniel finished, Cristiano was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I know what it's like to struggle," he said finally. "My mother worked as a cook and a cleaner. There were nights when we didn't have enough food. I remember the feeling of wanting to help but being too young to do anything about it." Daniel nodded, appreciating the sentiment but not expecting anything more. But then Cristiano did something that left him speechless. "I want to help," he said simply, "not just with your gas, with your life." Daniel frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" Cristiano pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, a second car arrived and a man in a suit stepped out, a representative from one of Cristiano's many charitable foundations. "This is Miguel," Cristiano explained. "He's going to help get you on your feet." Daniel was still trying to process what was happening when Cristiano continued. "I'm going to cover your debts, make sure you have some stability, and if you're willing, I'd like to offer you a job, something that allows you to spend more time with your son." Daniel's legs nearly gave out. You're serious?" Cristiano grinned. "I never joke about helping people." Tears filled Daniel's eyes, but this time, they weren't from exhaustion or frustration. They were from overwhelming gratitude. He wanted to protest, to say it was too much, but then he thought of Lucas, thought of all the nights he had tucked his son into bed, promising that things would get better, even when he wasn't sure how. And now, here was the answer to those prayers, standing in front of him in the form of a football legend. He took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to thank you." Cristiano patted his shoulder. "Just promise me one thing. Anything. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it. Pass it on." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "I will." Cristiano smiled. "Good." With that, he shook Daniel's hand firmly before climbing back into his car. As the engine roared to life, he gave one last wave before speeding off into the night, leaving behind a man whose life had just been irrevocably changed. Daniel stood there for a long time, the cold air biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe in something beyond struggle. He allowed himself to hope. And back in his small apartment, as Lucas lay sleeping, blissfully unaware of the miracle that had just unfolded, Daniel whispered a silent prayer of thanks, not just to God, but to the man who had stopped at a random gas station and decided, in that moment, to change a stranger's life forever. Daniel barely slept that night. His mind was too full. Of disbelief, of gratitude, of a cautious hope that this wasn't just a dream that would dissolve when the morning light crept through his small apartment's curtains. He kept replaying the moment over and over again, wondering if it had truly happened. The Cristiano Ronaldo, had not only paid for his gas, but had changed his entire life's trajectory in the span of a few minutes. By the time the first rays of sunlight streamed in, Daniel was already up, making breakfast for Lucas. His son, with his curly brown hair and bright, inquisitive eyes, was still rubbing the sleep from his face as he clambered onto the chair at the kitchen table. "Dad, why are you smiling so much?" Lucas asked groggily, looking at his father with mild amusement. Daniel hadn't even realized that he was smiling. He hadn't felt this light in months. "Just had a good night, buddy," he said, ruffling his son's hair. "Things are going to get better." Lucas, still half asleep, simply nodded, focusing instead on his cereal. But as Daniel watched him, his heart swelled with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Relief. For the first time in ages, he wasn't wondering how he was going to make ends meet. He wasn't panicking over bills or questioning if he'd have enough money to keep his car running for another week. He could breathe. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Daniel froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. His rent wasn't due for another week, and he had already paid the electric bill. Cautiously, he opened the door. To his utter shock, standing there was Miguel. The man Cristiano had introduced to him the night before, along with two other men in professional attire. Miguel smiled warmly, handing Daniel a thick envelope. "Good morning, Daniel. Cristiano wanted to make sure we got started on helping you right away," Miguel said. Daniel's hands trembled as he took the envelope, his pulse quickening. He opened it and immediately saw that it was filled with paperwork, official documents detailing the financial support Cristiano had promised. There were debt clearance forms, confirmation of an emergency fund set up in his name, and an offer letter for a new job. one that paid nearly twice what he was making at his two jobs combined. His throat tightened. I. I don't know what to say. Miguel chuckled. You don't have to say anything, just take a deep breath and know that things are changing for you. One of the other men, who introduced himself as Paulo, stepped forward. We've also secured an apartment upgrade for you and your son. It's in a safer neighborhood closer to schools and amenities. Cristiano wanted to make sure you had a fresh start. Daniel stared at them, struggling to comprehend what was happening. But why? Why me? Miguel smiled knowingly. Because you're a good man who has worked hard and never given up. And sometimes the universe, or in this case, Cristiano Ronaldo, decides that good people deserve a break. Tears burned at the back of Daniel's eyes, but he held them back. He shook Miguel's hand firmly. Tell him I won't waste this. I'll make the most of it. We know you will, Miguel said before handing over a set of keys. The new apartment is ready whenever you are. For the rest of the morning, Daniel sat in disbelief, looking through the documents over and over again as if expecting them to disappear. But they were real, every piece of it, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't fighting an uphill battle alone. 3 days later, Daniel and Lucas stood outside their new apartment, a modern, well-maintained building with a small playground in the courtyard. It was nothing extravagant, but to Daniel it was a palace compared to the cramped, aging flat they had been living in. Lucas ran inside excitedly, exploring every room. Dad, my own room has a window with a view, he called out joyfully. Daniel laughed, walking in behind him, feeling the weight that had been on his chest for years finally lifting. He couldn't stop thinking about Cristiano, about how a single encounter at a gas station had led to all of this. His new job started in a week. It was a managerial position at a logistics company owned by one of Cristiano's partners. Steady hours, good pay, and most importantly, weekends off to spend with Lucas. No more sleepless nights guarding empty buildings or dragging his exhausted body through a 12-hour supermarket shift. As Daniel unpacked, he took out a small notepad where he used to write down every expense, every unpaid bill, and every financial worry. Flipping through its worn pages, he realized he no longer needed it. He tore it in half, breathing out a laugh, and threw it in the trash. A week later, Daniel found himself in the stands of a packed stadium, something he never would have imagined possible. Cristiano had invited him and Lucas to watch a match, front row seats no less. It was Lucas's first time at a stadium, and the boy could hardly contain his excitement. He clutched his father's hand tightly, his eyes wide with awe as the players warmed up on the field. Do you think we'll get to see Ronaldo score? Lucas asked eagerly. Daniel chuckled. I think there's a good chance. As the game began, the energy in the stadium was electric. Every time Cristiano had the ball, the crowd roared, and then, just before halftime, he did what he did best, cutting past defenders with impossible agility before delivering a stunning strike straight into the net. The stadium erupted. Lucas jumped up cheering while Daniel smiled, shaking his head in amazement. And then something unexpected happened. As Cristiano jogged back to his position, he looked towards their section, spotted them, and pointed directly at Daniel and Lucas. Lucas gasped. Dad, he saw us. Daniel simply nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak. After the match, Daniel and Lucas were escorted to the players' lounge where Cristiano was waiting for them. The football star grinned as he knelt down to Lucas's level. Did you enjoy the game, little man? Lucas nodded vigorously. You're amazing! That goal was so cool! Cristiano laughed. I had some extra motivation today. He glanced at Daniel, his expression warm. How are you settling in? Daniel took a deep breath. Better than I ever thought possible. I don't know how to repay you. Cristiano shook his head. You don't have to. Just remember what I said. When you're in a position to help someone else, do it. Daniel nodded solemnly. I will. Cristiano smiled. Good. Now, how about a quick tour of the locker room? Lucas's eyes went impossibly wide. Really? Really? As Lucas bounced excitedly, Cristiano led them through the corridors, introducing them to players, coaches, and staff. Daniel, once just a struggling father who had worried about putting gas in his car, was now standing in the heart of one of the biggest football clubs in the world. Months passed and life only got better. Daniel excelled in his new job, finding a sense of purpose and stability he had never known before. Lucas thrived in his new school, making friends and even joining a youth football team. Every day, Daniel woke up feeling grateful beyond words, but he never forgot Cristiano's advice. One evening, after picking Lucas up from practice, they stopped at a small cafe. There, Daniel noticed a woman sitting alone, nervously flipping through a pile of bills with a look of despair on her face. He recognized that look all too well. After a moment's hesitation, he walked over and gently set a €100 bill on the table. "For your next meal," he said softly. The woman looked up in shock. I can't accept this." Daniel smiled. "Just pass it on when you can." As he walked away, Lucas looked up at him curiously. "Why did you do that, Dad?" Daniel ruffled his son's hair. "Because someone once did the same for me." And as they walked into the cool evening, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not just relief, not just hope, but a deep, undeniable joy. Cristiano Ronaldo had given him more than just financial security. He had given him the power to change lives, just as his own had been changed, and for that, he would always be grateful. Months passed, and Daniel's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. His new job provided him with financial security, his new apartment offered stability for Lucas, and for the first time in years, the weight of relentless struggle had lifted from his shoulders. But more than the material changes, something inside Daniel had shifted. He carried himself differently now, no longer with the weary burden of a man constantly fighting to stay afloat, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that better days were no longer a distant dream. Despite all the incredible things that had happened to him, Daniel remained grounded. He didn't let his circumstances make him complacent. He still woke up early every morning, packed Lucas's lunch, made breakfast, and walked him to school before heading to work. But there was a new sense of purpose in his life. He had been given an opportunity, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. However, Daniel never forgot the lesson Cristiano had left him with, the importance of passing on kindness. His first opportunity to do so came sooner than expected. It was a chilly evening in Lisbon when Daniel stopped at a local grocery store after work. He was picking up a few things for dinner when he noticed an elderly woman standing near the checkout, hesitating as she counted the coins in her trembling hands. She had a small basket with only a few essentials: bread, milk, eggs, but even that seemed to be too much for her budget. Daniel watched as she sighed, putting the eggs back onto the shelf with a defeated expression. The sight stirred something deep in him. He knew that feeling all too well, the silent shame of having to put something back because you just couldn't afford it. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said gently, "please let me take care of this for you." The woman looked up in surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Daniel insisted, his voice warm. "It's a small thing for me, but it would mean a lot to me if you let me help." Her eyes filled with gratitude as she nodded slowly. "Thank you, son. You have no idea how much this means to me." As he paid for her groceries, Daniel felt something powerful swell in his chest. It wasn't about the money. It was about the act itself, about lifting someone's burden, even if only for a moment. He understood now why Cristiano had told him to pay it forward. One afternoon, a few months later, Daniel was sitting in a cafe near his office when he overheard two men at the table behind him talking about a local charity struggling to raise funds for an upcoming event. They were discussing a children's football tournament meant to give underprivileged kids a chance to play. But without the necessary funding, it seemed unlikely to happen. Daniel's ears perked up. Football had always been a passion of his, even before life had thrown its challenges at him. And now, for the first time, he was in a position to help. Excusing himself, he turned around. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said politely. "I might know someone who could help with the funding." The men looked at him with mild surprise, but nodded. "We'll take any help we can get," one of them admitted. Daniel quickly made a call. He still had Miguel's number, the representative from Cristiano's foundation. After explaining the situation, Miguel promised to look into it. A week later, the charity received a generous donation, enough to not only fund the tournament, but also provide the kids with proper football kits, shoes, and equipment. The event went ahead as planned, and Daniel attended as a volunteer, helping organize the young players, setting up the field, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was during the final match of the tournament that he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You've been busy." Daniel turned and was stunned to see Cristiano standing there, dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, watching the game with an approving smile. "Cristiano!" Daniel exclaimed, shaking his hand warmly. "I didn't know you were coming." "I heard what you did," Cristiano said. "Miguel told me you reached out to help fund the tournament." Daniel shrugged, smiling. "It felt like the right thing to do." Cristiano studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're proving me right, you know." Daniel frowned. "About what?" "That night at the gas station," Cristiano said. "I saw something in you. A good man who just needed a little push, and here you are helping others just like I knew you would." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "You changed my life, Cristiano. How could I not pass that on?" Cristiano grinned and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning." Inspired by his experiences, Daniel began getting more involved in local charities, particularly those focused on single parents and struggling families. He started using his position at work to organize food drives, fundraising events, and mentorship programs for young people who, like him, had once felt stuck with no way forward. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. A year after his fateful encounter with Cristiano, Daniel was offered an even better position within his company, this time in a leadership role that allowed him to have a greater impact, not just on the business but on the community as well. Lucas, now 7, watched his father with admiration. "Dad, when I grow up, I want to help people like you do," he said one evening. Daniel smiled, pulling his son into a hug. "Then I know you're going to do amazing things, buddy." The transformation in Daniel's life had been remarkable, but he knew it all traced back to a single moment, a single act of kindness from a football legend who had chosen, in that moment, to change a stranger's life. It was 2 years later when Daniel got the chance to truly express his gratitude. Cristiano was in Lisbon for a charity event, and Daniel had been invited as a special guest. The event was filled with celebrities, athletes, and philanthropists, but when Cristiano saw Daniel across the room, his face lit up. "I see you've been busy," Cristiano said with a smirk as they embraced. Daniel chuckled. "You could say that." Cristiano nodded toward the crowd. "You belong in rooms like this now." Daniel took a deep breath. "I owe that to you." Cristiano shook his head. "No, Daniel, you did the work. I just gave you a push." Daniel swallowed hard before speaking. "I just want you to know that what you did for me, it didn't just change my life. It's changed the lives of so many others. Because of you, I was able to help people who needed it, and that means more than I can ever put into words." Cristiano's expression softened. "That's all I ever wanted, to make a difference." And at that moment, Daniel realized something profound. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about football. It was about impact. Cristiano had used his success to lift others up, to change lives, to create a chain reaction of kindness that stretched further than he could ever see. And now, Daniel was part of that chain. As they stood there, surrounded by the hum of conversation and the glow of flashing cameras, Daniel made a silent promise. He would never stop paying it forward, because kindness, true, selfless kindness, had the power to change the world. And it all started with one moment, one decision, one act of generosity, just like Cristiano had done for him that night at a gas station. As time passed, Daniel's journey continued to unfold in ways he had never imagined. His dedication to helping others had transformed him from a struggling single father into a well-respected community leader. The people around him no longer saw him as just another man trying to survive. They saw him as an inspiration, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. His story had begun to spread. Local news stations picked it up, and soon he found himself being invited to speak at schools and charity events. People wanted to know his story, not just because of Cristiano Ronaldo's involvement, but because of how he had chosen to take that moment of kindness and turn it into a movement of generosity. One evening, Daniel sat with Lucas on their balcony overlooking the city lights. The boy, now 8 years old, had grown into an energetic and compassionate child, one who understood the value of giving even at such a young age. "Dad," Lucas said, swinging his legs over the chair, "do you think one day I'll get to help people like you do?" Daniel smiled, placing an arm around his son's shoulders. "You already do, buddy. Every time you share, every time you stand up for someone, every time you show kindness, you're making a difference." Lucas grinned. "Then I want to do even more." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with pride. You will, and I'll be right there to help you. A few months later, Daniel received a call that would take his journey to yet another unexpected place. Cristiano's team had reached out, inviting him to an exclusive charity gala in Madrid, an event attended by some of the world's most influential figures in sports, business, and philanthropy. When Daniel arrived at the grand venue, he was in awe. The marble floors gleamed, and the chandeliers cast a warm glow over the elegantly dressed attendees. He wasn't the same man who had once struggled to pay for gas at a dimly lit station. He was now someone who belonged in rooms like these. As he made his way through the crowd, he saw Cristiano at the center of the event, effortlessly moving between guests, laughing and engaging in conversations. But the moment he spotted Daniel, he broke into a wide grin. "You made it," Cristiano said, pulling him into a handshake. "I wouldn't miss it," Daniel replied. Cristiano gestured toward the stage. "I have a surprise for you." A few moments later, Cristiano took the microphone and addressed the audience. He spoke about the power of giving, about how one act of kindness could change a life. Then he turned to Daniel. "There's someone in this room who reminds me of why I do what I do. Someone who took a small moment of kindness and turned it into something much bigger. Daniel, come up here." The room erupted into applause as Daniel stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding. "This man," Cristiano continued, "is proof that kindness doesn't stop with one person. It ripples outward, changing lives. And that's the kind of world we should all strive to create." At that moment, Daniel knew his life had come full circle, and it all began with a chance encounter at a gas station. As Daniel stood on the stage, the warmth of the applause washing over him, he could hardly believe how far he had come. The man who had once stood at a gas station counting his last euros to keep his car running was now standing in front of a crowd of philanthropists, entrepreneurs, and some of the most influential people in the world. But he hadn't made it here by accident. It was the result of one act of kindness that had ignited a fire within him. Cristiano handed him the microphone, his expression one of pride. Daniel took a deep breath before speaking. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today," he began. "A couple of years ago, I was just a struggling single father trying to make ends meet. I thought life had nothing left to offer me, that I had no way out. But then, one person, one extraordinary person, decided to extend kindness to me when I needed it the most. And that moment changed everything." The audience was silent, hanging on to his every word. "But what I've learned," Daniel continued, "is that kindness is not just about what we receive, it's about what we do with it." Cristiano didn't just help me. He gave me the strength to believe in myself again. And because of that, I was able to turn around and help others. I was able to give hope to people who felt as lost as I once did, and that's what true generosity is. It doesn't stop with one act. It continues, it spreads, it transforms lives. Cristiano clapped as Daniel finished his speech, and the audience followed with an ovation that was even louder than before. After the event, dozens of people approached Daniel, some wanting to hear more about his story, others inspired to do more in their own communities. One man, a business leader, even offered to collaborate on expanding his charity work, suggesting new ways to support struggling families and single parents like him. As the night wound down, Daniel found himself standing with Cristiano on the venue's terrace, looking out at the Madrid skyline. "You've come a long way," Cristiano said, taking a sip from his glass of water. Daniel nodded. "I still can't believe it sometimes. I used to think people like me didn't get second chances." Cristiano turned to him, his expression serious. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Daniel. They just need someone to remind them that it's possible." Daniel smiled, the weight of those words sinking in. He had become that person for others, just as Cristiano had been for him. "Thank you," Daniel said after a moment. "Not just for what you did for me that night, but for believing in me." Cristiano grinned. "I didn't just believe in you, I knew you'd do something great." And as they stood there, two men from vastly different worlds bound by a single act of kindness, Daniel realized something. This was only the beginning. There were more people to help, more lives to change, and he was ready. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on Cristiano Ronaldo's surprise for the struggling single dad? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.